Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 93 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, I am joined by Darby McDevitt, a game developer and writer. I would like to give a quick shout out to Dr. Jackson Crawford, who helped connect us and make this fun conversation possible. I spoke with Dr. Crawford last summer about his historical consulting work for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so if you haven't listened to that episode yet, it's a fun companion to today's episode. Darby has worked primarily as a writer, filmmaker, musician, and game designer, and is probably best known for his work on Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series. He has served as the narrative director or scriptwriter for both story and dialogue for multiple titles in the Assassin's Creed franchise, including Unity, Black Flag, Revelations, Bloodlines, and Valhalla, and is currently working on Ubisoft Montreal's upcoming title, Assassin's Creed Codename Hexa. In this episode, we chatted about how he curated a love of writing and history via his Irish heritage and Ulysses, his experience writing for multiple games in the Assassin's Creed series, navigating anachronistic inclusions and non-historical concessions in AC games, and his thoughts on AC's Discovery Tour mode. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today. I want to just start us off and ask you, when did you discover you had a passion for, ancient history, ancient world stuff?
Well, probably the opportunity to write for the Assassin's Creed series unlocked that on a broad scale because I've always been into writing and always been into literature since a pretty young age. And then my family had a mild obsession with our Irish ancestry. So I was always interested in Irish history, but I was pretty narrowly focused on that tiny little island in the Atlantic. But I knew a lot about it. So I think early 2009, I was living in Seattle, working in a company just outside Seattle. And they got contracted by Ubisoft, the Montreal studio, to do a small sequel to their game that had just come out, Assassin's Creed, the first one, which was set in the Holy Land in the 12th century during Third Crusades. And so they said, hey, we have this opportunity to make this game. Do you want to be the lead writer? It's going to be a quick project. It's going to be like a 10-month project. But as soon as I started communicating with the people in Montreal who were responsible for the first game and were now working on the second game set in the Italian Renaissance, I got this sense wow, these people have an incredible passion for history and they take this very seriously. And I'd never worked that way in games before. So many games, or I think a lot of the games I worked on were a Disney game or a Marvel game or a Lord of the Rings game. And so there are all these pop culture properties where the research you need to do is just go read some comic books, reread the Lord of the Rings, etc. And so this was go buy 10 books and get up to speed with this time period. What was strange about writing the sequel to the first Assassin's Creed game is set in Damascus and Acre and Jerusalem. So pretty well-known places. The Crusades are a fairly well-known period of history. But the sequel fell in these years that not a whole lot happened. And they said, and we want it to happen on Cyprus. So I had to go read the history of Cyprus from 1192 to 1193 or something like that. And one major event happened there, which was that someone shipwrecks there. Is it Richard Coeur de Lion or some Templars, actual Templars? Anyway, something happened there. And so I was okay, I'm going to work in this one historical event into the story, into the deep background. But nonetheless, even though I didn't have a whole lot of pop culture foundations to work from, it was a really interesting experience to just go buy a number of books on the subject and start reading and see what you could pull from history to make an interesting story. I don't know that I got very good at it until maybe I was writing later Assassin's Creed games, but certainly the first couple, I enjoyed the process of finding the source material and really trying to craft a story from it. That's your goal, is to read a bunch of stuff, synthesize it into a fictional story, and hope that the stuff you've read comes through. And when I was in Ireland, I was lucky enough to work with a playwright. God, I want to say his name's Frank McGuinness. And he gave us a really interesting insight into his process. He had written a play about an Irish regiment in World War I. And he said, I just read, and I don't do anything else. and I barely take notes. And at a certain point, when I feel like I'm full of facts and I can't stand it anymore, and like the story wants to be written, I just stop and I write. And I don't even look back at what I've read because I want to see what stuck with me. And then only then, after I have a first draft, do I go back and I check what I've written against the things that I've read. And I always thought that was really interesting. Without even thinking about it, I probably adopt that method too. I read a lot of stuff, but I try not to really impose any structure on it. And then when I write, I don't go back and look at my notes too much. And it's true because you feel like just certain things stick out, either a small detail or a big sweeping kind of movement, let's say.
Yeah. I tend to start off just because I want to sort of get a good, baseline for like, when did people come to history? Because I know some kids like me, we start when we're, like 6, and then we're like, that's all I want to do.
Yeah.
And some people, come to it later. So just to kind of set the stage then for the more history-focused listeners who listen to the show.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a step back and say, okay, so you got into it with the job. You got into ancient history with the gaming.
Yeah, let's say in my 30s, in my early 30s.
Gotcha. So then basically to figure out how you got there before you even started the work stuff, what kind of stories did you like? Did you listen to? Was it mostly kind of like family history, folk tales, or did you just kind of like mythology on the side? Was it a lot of like comic book?
It was always about Ireland. Weirdly enough, like in college, I think I'm pretty typical of the sort of guy who goes to college from my background who like gets into like the big books, Thomas Pynchon. And of course, I found my way to James Joyce. I started reading, a lot of Ulysses. And if you're into Joyce, you need to start reading history. So much of his project and his big 4 works are rooted in the Irish colonial experience. And Ulysses itself is like a celebration of a specific day and a specific time just before the Irish Revolution. But of course, the book is written after the Revolution, so it's kind of commenting on it and setting the stage for it. So just in becoming a huge James Joyce fan and by osmosis, a Samuel Beckett fan, you start to learn about Irish history, and you learn to not separate the fiction and the art that they're creating with the history that's happening there. It was the first time I feel like I really felt this grand fusion of like a lot of disciplines in Joyce's writing. It's not just fiction, it's poetry and it's music and it's history. And I really, really liked that. And I thought, oh, huge bar to live up to too when you're a young writer and you're like, how do I do that? And the answer at the time was not like, go write video games. I think the first game I wrote was called The Clue Finder's Incredible Toy Store Adventure. Not a lot of history in that one. Through my 20s, Joyce especially was a touchstone. And by way of him, I'd find myself flipping through Irish books on Tan Boculia, the Irish mythology series. Books like At Swim Two Birds with Flann O'Brien is a very weird shaggy dog story that incorporates a ton of Irish mythology too. So you really have to get into that. And so, yeah, I'd say through my 20s, it was like the only country that existed was Ireland. The only country that had a history was Ireland for me. And then finally, getting to Assassin's Creed. And probably around that time too, probably right after I moved to Montreal, discovered like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series, right? Which I think is a good entry point for a lot of people. First 2 I listened to were the huge Roman Empire one and the Mongol one, which is like 5 parts, and the Roman one's 6 parts. And it's these huge sweeping things, and you like get swept up in it. And it's just a guy telling a story, and it's fascinating. So at that point, when you see that history can be arranged in the right way for the right audience, it can be so deeply fascinating and engrossing. And I think we're working on Assassin's Creed for so long, since 2009, with very few little breaks in between. But that's always the project, is to how do we make this period really interesting so that somebody who never thought they'd be interested in history is absolutely devouring this stuff. Hopefully we boost the sales of, certain history books every time we put out a new opus.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's awesome. I think my mom has like a bit of Irish in her background, but it's really fun. I didn't come to Irish mythology until like college myself, but once I started it, I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then I had a chance to study abroad in Ireland, and I took like a Irish literature and mythology course and like an Irish archaeology course. And I was like, hey, this looks like really cool.
Cool. What school? Where'd you go?
So I studied for summer at NUI Galway.
Okay. Yeah. I was in UCD is what it was called. National University of Ireland, Dublin now.
Yeah, no, I did a lot of weekend trips to Dublin, which I still love to this
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
So, maybe I'll go back and do something there. But yeah, no, I mean, that's a really cool entry point. It's a really cool touchstone, especially since Irish mythology is kind of insane.
Yeah, a bit.
Like, I grew up with like Greek stuff, but then I come to Irish mythology and then there's someone who like gets hit in the head with a piece of cheese from a slingshot and dies. And I'm like, these people are
Yeah,
insane.
or the guy
Like, what
who,
are they doing?
or the one who wants to fight the sea. And it's funny too, because I remember distinctly when I was going to school there, because I have a master's in Anglo-Irish literature and drama. So it's like the last 200 years of Irish literature in English. That there was a little, I think while I was there, or maybe one of my other trips, there was a Viking expedition or a exhibition. And up until that moment, it didn't occur to me, or I didn't even realize that, that Dublin's a Viking settlement. And that if you look at the map, you see all these like different little villages that eventually just grew together to become this sort of messy city. But yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, we'll get to that because I definitely love the
Okay.
Ireland DLC where you bring it into
Yeah.
Valhalla, and I was like, oh my gosh. But
I didn't write that, unfortunately. Yeah.
okay, it's fine. It exists. It's
Yeah.
in the universe at
Yes.
least. But did you always know that you wanted to write specifically, or did you ever kind of have like that moment where you're like, could I do something else, something similar?
I think it's more in the second pathway. When I was very young, 6 years old, my parents brought home an Atari 2600. So I played a lot of that, Indiana Jones, Combat, Pitfall. And at the same time, I was reading a lot, probably a lot of early like Dungeons and Dragons type books and Stephen King and, at 10 or 11. And I remember distinctly sitting down one time trying to write a novel. I called it The Darkness or something like that. It was about an inscrutable darkness that ate people or something like that. And I got like 10 pages into that and abandoned it. And then combining those two loves, I wrote a huge 10-page story proposal for a company called Sierra Online, which made like King's Quest and Space Quest and those kind of games. And I sent it to them saying, hey, could you hire me? I'm 13 and I live in Spokane, Washington. And they wrote back and they said, well, our people who work for us have to live here in Fresno. And I was like, okay, I'll move to Fresno. They didn't actually say no. They were saying no, but I didn't hear that they were saying no. My dad's like, well, if you can find a place in Fresno, and this is before the internet. So you're like, okay, how do I do that? Huh? And then I realized after a few days, oh, they're actually letting me down softly. I was always combining my love for writing and video games. Then I got into music and I went to university my first year for audio engineering, but I was kind of dissatisfied with the program. So I switched back to literature. And that's what I got, a literature and writing concentration degree. And so I thought, okay, I'll focus on writing. But music has also never left me. So I'm always like fiddling with that. So it's like I've always been trying to cobble together all these loves. And my first real interesting, honest job was in video games when I was only 24. And I got hired on the strength of some writing samples. I got hired to write. So it was at least like this job right out of college, or pretty much right out of college, that was combining two of my early loves for video games and for writing. And on the side, I always wrote other things like, okay, I'm writing short stories and attempting to write books and things like that. But video games has always kept me really, really busy. And I love the process of design, the challenge of design. So it would be hard to like leave video games and then never think about them again if I wanted to just write, say, novels or something, or screenplays, because the challenge that goes into design, and if you've played one of our games, the challenge that goes into making an open world is so vastly different than making slaving away in a solitary fashion on a novel or a screenplay. You're really working for years and years to bring an entire time period to life, and you want to make sure that you get the details right. Somebody can be just walking through a place that's off the beaten path and see something and go like, wow, I'm really glad they thought of this small detail. And I got to discover it on my own. I think the self-directed aspect of video games is always really compelling, and maybe for people who don't play video games, they don't understand that aspect of it. But there is the exploratory quality of open worlds is something quite unique. I always called Ulysses the first open world novel, because the joke that Joyce always gave is that if Dublin disappeared from the earth, you could rebuild it brick by brick by reading my book. And it's because he just kind of put this almost catalog of detail in it that sometimes serves no narrative purpose. It's just a catalog for catalog's sake. which is kind of cool, kind of like Moby Dick in some ways, right? Like it's just the ultimate whaling manual. And so video games can be like that. And I actually remember, I think it was Salman Rushdie once called video games open worlds horizontal storytelling. And whoever did say that, if that wasn't Salman Rushdie, forgive me. But I really like that image where it's like we put everything out there for you, and you wander in a direction. And if the world's created in a compelling way, that you're going to discover things in your own time, at your own pace, and not necessarily in a dramatic narrative fashion, which has a very specific structure, but in a structure that follows the map of your own curiosities and your own mind. And that's really, really interesting.
Yeah. As a gamer, yeah, I get it. I love them. But, I'm curious though, did your parents or family or anyone, like friends, did they bring up any reservations? Like, do you really want to get into games? Like, I grew up with parents who were like, you do not get to own any sort of gaming system because it will just mush your brain and then you'll have like no social life. And so I seriously was barred until I think the Wii came out. And then my dad actually was like, okay, this one seems more harmless than the others. You can get one.
Yeah. No, I don't. They never, I don't think they ever even understood what it was I did for a long, long time. They probably thought, oh, that's a temporary thing until he, gets a real job. And of course, like you'll hear this because games were so niche back in the 80s when I grew up. It didn't feel like really the Nintendo Entertainment System was the first one that just started to really bring it into the broader consciousness, but like especially the Atari and like ColecoVision and early PC games that had like 4 colors on the screen and like, or even text adventures. It was just writing, Zork. And these games, they seemed like they were like being beamed in from another planet by people way far away that made these things, and you just were lucky to like be in to discover them. So it didn't really seem like a reasonable thing to say like, oh yeah, you can actually make a living doing that. And I actually stepped away from video games. Most of the time I was in college, I didn't own any game systems. And it wasn't until I left college, and I'm not going to be the next James Joyce, at least not right now. So, not at 23, I haven't done anything. So I better get a job. So then, I saw all these Seattle, right? So it's a good video game city. Valve had just started up, and I wonder if Bungie was there. But anyway, it was just a great city. And so you'd always see these job ads for video game companies. And I didn't have programming experience. I just had a lot of creativity and a lot of writing experience. So I just kept looking, waiting. Okay, come on, there's going to be a job that just asks for good writing skills. And one showed up. And so I took it.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like a lot of attitudes, but also with changing of technology and stuff between when you were starting up and like if you were trying to get into games now, obviously it's like night and day different. But I mean, I guess from all your experience in the industry now, like, do you see a huge change in kind of like what people look for people who want to get into games? Because obviously I'm sure it's not as easy, right? You can't just like go on a job board and suddenly there's like 10 jobs for games available. So
it's hard to say. I mean, I haven't, because the work I did in Seattle and how I got hired at Ubisoft, I don't think I've applied for a job in the game industry since like 2002. So I don't actually know how hard it is. But what I will say is games now are a sort of a multi-medium, in that I think every single kind of medium you can think of is used or can be used in games. You have audio, music, cinema, script writing or playwriting, writing, dramatic writing, prose writing, animation, visual arts, programming, like every single thing you could. We have historians on our brand, right? So I think the kind of job you can get in the video game industry has expanded like crazy. So in that sense, we welcome in, or we have the need of a broader set of people. If you work in any kind of entertainment industry at all, or even adjacent to it, there's a good chance you could get a job in the game industry somewhere. But then back in the day, back to your actually earlier question, my parents actually didn't really know what I did or the scope of what I did until I think my dad wrote to me and he's like, hey, I just read an article that said the game industry made more than the music industry this year. I was like, yes, yeah, that happens because more people play games than buy records now or whatever. This was probably when like the streaming services hadn't come out yet. But anyway, so I think that's when he started to realize like, oh, like multiple games that I've worked on, sold 10, 20 million copies. So he's like, oh, okay. So now he can tell the people at his like little coffee circle down there like, oh, my son, he was in a YouTube video. yesterday. I was like, wow. I always remember like seeing him on TV, public television in Spokane, like, well, there's Dad. Oh, he's famous. Like, it's public television. So yeah, what was the question? But sorry. Yeah, how has it changed? There's more and more and more jobs. And yet, yeah, I think maybe games take longer to make now by and large. There is a higher level of quality that's sort of expected. Maybe things have evened out. There's more jobs, but the skill ceiling is a little higher. But certainly, I mean, there's so many indie companies. I think anyone who wants to work in video games, the main thing is to just get in. And there's lots of small indie companies, or even make a game or work on a game with a friend and try to get it out there, because the experience of making one is the best teacher. They're very complex little organisms, and you just don't know what you don't know until you go through the whole process. And then you're like, okay, that's how it all fits together. So I'd say there's plenty of opportunity out there for people.
Good. Well, hopefully there's a bunch of people with aspirations somehow to get into gaming somewhere along the line. So it's nice to hear that, okay, there, if you didn't, go to school just for, programming or whatever, there is hope for you, essentially,
exactly. Yeah.
The message.
Yeah, I was just a short story writer with a love for video games, a demonstrated love. So I could demonstrate that passion. Interviewed, and they, on the strength of writing samples and the strength of my knowledge of, I could get my way around a computer, and so they hired me to write.
Nice. Well, okay, I'm going to just dive right in because I'm sure my audience is probably expecting me to. So I talk a lot about Assassin's Creed on the show and just in my life, so they're probably like, how has she not gotten into that already? So I will, kind of like find it. So yeah, you started kind of near the beginning because you wrote on the Italian trilogy on Ezio's games. And so since you mentioned that, you didn't have a huge, big history background, was it easy to try to get into that? Did you just say, okay, what are your book recs, and then read it and you're like, oh, okay, I know what to do? Or was it a bit harder because you had to find a way within just here's a bunch of books, read them?
I don't have any memories of it being difficult. It was almost all fun and exciting. Like I said, the first game I wrote was at the Holy Land, I guess, duology, if you will, the Altair games. And then, actually, at the same time they were making that, Ubisoft Montreal was making Assassin's Creed 2. So that it had not, the Ezio character had not been unleashed yet. I think maybe while we were working on it, the trailer dropped and everyone was, oh, it's the Renaissance. The Da Vinci Vitruvian Man was right there. And like, oh, so it gave everyone a clue about where Assassin's Creed is going next. On the strength of that reveal, maybe Ubisoft actually came to us at the same time we were making the Altair game, and they said, would you make an Ezio Nintendo DS game as well? And we want Ezio to go and interact with Christopher Columbus in Spain. And for those who know, like, Assassin's Creed 2 actually spans 28 years. And there's a couple big gaps in the story, right? There's like a 5 or 7 year gap at points. And so like in that big 7 year gap, well, Ezio's thinking about this one thing, he's going to go off to Spain and get involved in another thing and then come back. And so, yeah, he goes, so we made this small little handheld game, takes him to Spain. So did some quick research about the influence of the Moorish culture on Spain, and just the beautiful intermingling of those cultures, and trying to figure out like where to, okay. And then is it Ferdinand and Isabella and Christopher Columbus, and I can barely remember that game because I wrote it so fast. I literally wrote that game, researched and wrote it in 6 weeks, because they were like, we need this game now and it needs to be so I was like, okay, so that was probably my most poorly researched game because it had to come out so fast. So I grabbed a book and probably read a bunch of long articles on, that's maybe the one story I'd be like, can I have a do-over, please? And we had Thomas Torquemada, the Inquisitor, had him there briefly. Doing what, I don't know. So those two games came out and they did well enough that Ubisoft the next year, 2010, wanted another Ezio game. They were making Brotherhood, and they wanted me to write another DS game that was set in Istanbul or Constantinople. And we started working on that game, and it got announced at E3 just as a title, Assassin's Creed Lost Legacy. And then literally 2 weeks later, Ubisoft called us up and said, actually, we're going to cancel this game. And I was really bummed out. That was the only game I was working on that year in 2010. And I'd been working in games for 11 years at that point. And I was like, I've had some ups and I've had some downs, but I don't want to do this anymore. So I decided I would spur of the moment move to New York and get into film editing because I'd made some films on the side too. And so I said goodbye to Seattle. But on my way to New York, I got a phone call from Montreal and said, hey, we heard you left your job. Do you want to come work for us now? You can't headhunt. When somebody works at a company, you're not supposed to approach anybody if they don't approach you. But now that I was not working at this company anymore, they called me up and they pitched me the game that they wanted to make, which was an Ezio game for the Xbox and PlayStation set in Constantinople. And I said, oh, that's the idea I was just working on that got canceled. And they're like, yeah, we love the idea so much, just the setting, that we're just upgrading it to a AAA game. So we're going to just do, so that's what became Assassin's Creed Revelations. The story changed fairly significantly, but the setting is the same, right? The idea of Ezio traveling to Constantinople at the time. I guess Istanbul was used. So, okay, I get to use all that research that I did, because I really did some research for that one, and then get to revive that research 6 months later. And now the scope of it's the first time I get to write scenes that will actually be shot by motion capture actors, and not just, an actor in a booth with a mic. It's like actual guys acting things out. You have a full suite of tools available to you to tell an interesting story. You get this 3D world to run around in rather than the 2D world that it used to be. So it was really a step up, and really that's where I learned everything about making games at this higher level, this AAA level, this 1 year that I worked on Revelations. And of course, so much cool stuff was happening at Ubisoft at the time, because Revelations was being worked on. When I moved there, Brotherhood had just come out, so Revelations was being worked on, but Assassin's Creed 3 was also being worked on. So the American Revolution, and also Unity was being worked on. It's very, very early stages. So that's the French Revolution. So there was so much good stuff. You wander down any hall and you go from seeing early American flags with 13 stars, and to trois couleurs, the French flag, and did I say that right? I don't know. My French is still bad. And then Istanbul, just a crazy time, and it was beautiful. You really felt like the potential of the brand just was unlimited in those days. Still is, because there's a lot of history out there, but we hadn't even gotten to the very obvious ones yet, So it was cool.
Yeah, I mean, I know you have a lot of experience on so many different games and so many different roles. I think I saw it was like Unity, Black Flag, you had some Origins in there, obviously Valhalla.
Yeah.
I mean, so you've gotten to work on so many different, very distinct time periods that are all very different. Have you found, do you have a favorite sort of time period or geographic region that you kind of really enjoy? Or are they all just special and amazing in their own way?
I definitely have favorite time periods, but each project is special in a different way. Revelations, the Ottoman Empire. This is right just before the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. So it's really getting into a golden age of that. Researching that and learning, and actually getting to go to Istanbul to sell the game at a press event, and staying there for 5 days and giving the press tours of the city, a city I'd never been in, but I'd researched so much that I could sort of talk, that we had a real tour guide, but she would always defer to me when it came time to what's the context of this place in the game, and I could talk about it like I knew what I was talking about. So that trip was very special. Black Flag is the golden age of piracy. That one's just special because I felt like the writing came together very well. Unity, I did a lot of script touch up for that one, so it was fun to work with the team to sort of bring characters to life, but I didn't participate in as much the research. Origins, though, I did do about 2 years of research and helped develop the base of that game. The characters Bayek and Aya, and the places that you'll go, and the cities and the history. I think that's probably the most fun historical research I'd ever done. I think ancient, and do you call it classical Egypt if it's in the Ptolemaic period? Is that how or would you just say Ptolemaic Egypt, I guess?
You could say Hellenistic Egypt,
yeah.
I think Ptolemaic we use.
Yeah. It just doesn't feel like ancient Egypt, right? But because there was also a time where very early we were saying If we do Egypt, which period of Egypt? We could have easily done, Akhenaten or Akhenaten, and
Yeah,
and
Akhenaten.
Akhenaten, and we could have done that period in that really interesting period of this brief monotheistic points and it's almost 3,000 years of history. I think our creative director Jean Guédon, I think he picked Cleopatra for a couple obvious reasons. One, I mean, Cleopatra and Caesar is just putting that on a box is like, that's cool. You're going to sell a lot with that. But also, the further you are in time, the more technology is available, and that helps you as a game designer. It helps you come up with tools and ideas. And imagine setting an Assassin's Creed game before iron or even before bronze. You'd have a wooden hidden blade or whatever. Before the wheel, what would that be like? So I think the further you go forward with Assassin's Creed, you're like, oh, we get guns, oh, we get carriages, oh, we get. There's an obvious question if you're going to go into the 20th century with Assassin's Creed, and you do any cities, you're going to have cars. You're going to have, Syndicate. Syndicate was in Victorian London, and they had carriages, and they had to come up with a whole system for traffic and carriages and driving, and that's not a small thing to make for a video game. So imagine going forward, into the mid 20th century, that you're stepping into, territory that's already done by like the Watch Dogs series or Grand Theft Auto or any other, modern open world game. So I think a lot of people have felt pretty comfortable, like, let's not dip our toe into the 20th century just yet until necessary. We've got so much other stuff we can do, and horses are great. Swords are great. Bow and arrows, great. So yeah, so Origins, like I said, really an amazing time. I've still got, right here, I've still got beside me the complete cities of ancient Egypt, the complete gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. Like, I've got this all on my bookshelf. I still have all that research material. I have a huge, beautiful, like, facsimile of a Book of the Dead that I really enjoyed. Incomprehensible, but beautiful. And so, yeah, and then Valhalla, also an incredible research opportunity. Got to work with Jackson Crawford, who you interviewed a while ago. He was super fun. And that was also a wonderful, wonderful experience. And a harder story to tell, because there's like if you could call it, it's probably not accurate to say the Norse diaspora, because that's not quite how it. Raiders are not exactly diaspora, I guess, but really like trying to figure out where you want to tell that story, because the Norse people had their, they got all the way as far down as Constantinople and into Russia and Dublin, and so covering that territory was an interesting challenge, but that was also really fun. And I guess definitely the mythology of ancient Egypt is great. Possibly also because it's so obtuse. It doesn't, like, we don't have stories and like deep, weird stories like we do with the Norse gods. There are stories, but they're not told with, I feel like, such vigor, that we have with the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. I think with the Egyptian gods and goddesses, you're always sort of piecing together fragments and trying to get a sense of how they operated. And that was one of my fun challenges in both Valhalla and Origins, was how does this mythology manifest in a daily life? What is the practice of religion at this period? When I think of growing up in proximity to a lot of Christians, I'm not a Christian myself, but in proximity to a lot of Christians, I see the ritual and even the small details at church, lighting of votive candles and crossing yourself and all these things. When you start to think about the Norse religion and the Egyptian religions, you, as a writer, you try, like, how do I depict that? And like, should I make something up? Should I use my best guess? And we don't have a lot of understanding of how the daily practice of these things, especially when a lot of the Norse stuff is filtered through Christianity. So it's like maybe the Christians kind of assumed it functioned this way because it functions that way for them. It's, again, like, you never know if you did it right, but you have fun trying to think about it. And that's it. That play, if you've played Valhalla, there's a big story element that goes around, like, bringing the Norse sagas to life, or the not the sagas, the mythology to life, and how we depict it on screen for the character who you're playing. And I won't spoil anything, but it's deeply integrated. The mythology is deeply integrated into our story.
Yeah, I mean, from what you're describing, obviously, as a writer on it, you get to sort of turn into mini historians because you have to read all the books
Yeah.
and do all the things, and then suddenly you're like an expert in like a very specific thing, whatever you're working on. You touched on it a bit earlier, but I'm wondering, like, just maybe going a bit deeper, but obviously there are the considerations of from the gaming perspective, what's easiest to do, what makes sense, to have an entertaining game, because at the end of the day, it's edutainment, right? It's
Yep.
still media.
Yeah.
But like, I think one of the big things when I talk to my Egyptologist colleagues, we do go back and forth and we're like, yeah, Origins is great, but I mean, man, why did they choose that time period? Like, oh man, I wanted something in like the Old Kingdom. So,
Yeah.
how much as a writer on it, right? Like, so where is that kind of bar where it's like, okay, I really want to do this history. I like this history, but also this is not the easiest thing in terms of gameplay and
Yeah.
accessibility.
Yeah.
So where is that line where you have to say, okay, stop, historian side of me. I can't do this as much as I want to.
It happens very frequently. And I can't even count the number. Like, it's probably every day where you're confronted with a question of a detail. Just take the idea of money, right? Like, in the ancient world, and especially in like say the medieval period, there's no standard currency, and there's no nation state boundaries really. Different people are minting different coins and having, probably negotiating different values, and especially with like the Vikings, there's this thing called hack silver, where you just like, okay, I'm just going to cut off about this much and give that to you. I'll cut my armband and cut that off, and there you go, and that weighs about this much, so I'll give you this much in return. But for a video game, you'd be like, do I really want the player to keep track of 73 different currencies in his pocket? Like, are you really going to have like a jar where you're like, oh, this one's from Morocco, this one's from Paris, this one? You can't do that. So we came up with, okay, so what are we going to say on screen? You've acquired ching silver, right? Or I think, what was it in Origins? Akche, was that right? Same thing with the pirate game, right? Like, I think there was a moment where like people wanted to say like, oh, you've got 50,000 pounds or something like that, because it was British. Like, that doesn't seem right when you're dealing with big treasure chests of Spanish gold. Like, so that's just a single example. Another example I use a lot is, this is the weirdest one, and it's in many ways it's the most unfortunate but also the most understandable. I've used this example many times. When we were researching for Black Flag in the pirate game, you realize very quickly that when you read about pirates, they didn't often attack soldiers. They almost never attack soldiers because they're just pirates. They've got a bunch of like half working guns. Maybe they're lucky to have 6 or 8 cannons on board their tiny little sloop. And they are sailing around in fast little tiny ships looking for merchants who they can rob really fast and get out of there. And then when they see a merchant, they pull up aboard, they fire in the air, maybe fire across the bow once or twice. They scare the bejesus out of people, jump aboard, steal all their stuff, most times leave them without incident, sometimes steal their boat, sometimes commit heinous acts of violence. But otherwise, then they get out of there. And so when, as game designers, we're like, wait a minute, so you're telling me that in this pirate game, there's going to be no ship battles, and there's going to be no sword fights, and there's going to be very few sword fights and very few gun battles? So yeah, because that's the truth. Like, well, we can't have that. We expect like broadsides, bow, 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 acrid smoke in your face, and then swing across, swashbuckling, boarding with your saber and brace of pistols and pow, pow, pow. Okay, so what do? We make it so that in Black Flag, the only people you attack are the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, which would never, ever have happened. But in order to satisfy this sort of fantasy of like, I'm a pirate swashbuckler, we made that early decision now. And actually, we did think about, or even maybe we even prototyped the concept of scaring merchant ships into giving up their goods. It really never came to fruition, because it's like, what do? You like okay, sail really close to them and just kind of stick there and push a button to leer at them. And okay, fire your gun, but don't hit him. Don't hit anything, right? It's very non-intuitive for game design. Mainstream game design, if you look for like chess or checkers or even, Mario Brothers, or it's kind of this, there's a Boolean operation, which is either I'm dead or you're dead. And I need to understand that relationship. If I'm Mario and I'm racing from left to right on the screen, and there's a guy in front of me, I can either jump over him so I stay alive, or I can squash him so he dies. But if he touches me, I die, and then I have to start over. So don't do that. In chess, it's either I take your piece or you take my pieces. So there's that kind of binary, I win or you win, extends a lot into game. Now, this game design is more sophisticated than that for sure. But when you're making big AAA games, there is always an element of that, right? There's always this element of like, I have to feel as a player that I am winning, that I'm moving forward in some sense, that I'm getting stronger. That's a pretty mainstream game design philosophy, and because it works, it's really fun. That is pretty contrary to the way that history works. Games are very frequently an upward progression of strength. That is not how history or anything, any system on earth works. Evolution, even evolution or evolution of languages. We don't set out, I guess we as people, we can go out during the day and feel like, oh, I did 3 things and I leveled up like me practicing French. I leveled up my French skill. Okay, I'm on an upward trend. But life and history does not fit into that category very easily. There's not this obvious progression of improvement or strength or intelligence or whatever it is. And so, long story short, thrust of history does not easily slot into the needs of game design. And so you're always making concessions. Man, we could do, if I thought about it and I wrote them down, we could have a second episode where I just go over all of the concessions I've ever made in every single one of these games. Something like in Valhalla, right? You can get a lot of weapons in the game, but if you look at the variety of weapons that existed in 9th century England, it's not much. It's, some Dane axes, some regular axes, one-handed swords. I don't think there were many two-handed swords at the time in the 9th century. Spears, certainly, but not a huge amount of variety. But when you're in a video game and it's a really long game, you want to be like, oh, I'm always collecting stuff. I'm upgrading my stuff. So there's a lot of anachronistic weapons in Valhalla, right? And when I was looking at them and the artists were showing me, here's all of our weapons. And I was like some of these, like, are very clearly like 14th or 15th century, like, and I was like, I made the decision. I was like, I'm just going to name it what it was named, like the Zweihander or Doppelhander or whatever. Because of the nature of our game, this animus that can kind of time travel. I'm like, okay, let's pretend that the animus is pulling from a future century and just plopping it in your game. But I didn't want to come up with some nonsensical fake name. I just said, okay, here, I'm going to pull from other historical periods and slap them in there. And it's going to be anachronistic for this game, but it's still going to feel hopefully somewhat historical.
It's fair, right?
Yeah. We invented a weird tool, right? I think the animus, which is for the viewers or the listeners that don't know, in our series, we're a science fiction history series, not just a history series. So all the games happen in the context of someone in the present or the near future getting into a device called the animus and re-experiencing what we call the genetic memories of your ancestors or another person's ancestors. So it's as if like the many terabytes of information that are needed to reproduce a time period are being pulled from your DNA or someone's DNA and shown back to you as an interactive simulation. So that means that we have centuries or millennia of data to pull from. So even if you're playing a game that's set in the 9th century, we can pull something from the 14th century and just bloop, put it right in your game. That's Jeanne d'Arc's holy sword right there in Ivar the Boneless's hands or something like that. Don't question it. It's science fiction.
That's like the best defense. But for like a game series as popular as Assassin's Creed, for a major, huge gaming company, you definitely have more creative freedom than like other places and people, for sure. But I'm a bit curious, and I've always been a bit curious, like, do you as writers and creators still sort of feel like pressure just from like other pop culture influences that are already around, where you're like, okay, we have the freedom to do this pirate game, but like we've had movies like the Pirates of the Caribbean series around forever, and that's what people have in their mind, versus trying to introduce people to like completely new concepts and things. So like, do you actually have to bow to that pressure?
That's actually a question that comes up every single time we start a new project, especially if the project is touching on some kind of very obviously popular touchstone, right? So pirates, certainly, Vikings, certainly, even the American Revolution, right? We have these conversations at the beginning of the project where we actually talk explicitly about how much we want to honor the pop culture references. And like, do we want to give our audience just a little bit of that fantasy? Because if for people who are really into pirates and they want to play Pirates of the Caribbean, the video game, and they come to our game looking for it, and we totally disappoint them with, we don't have magical krakens and, whatever. We want to sort of at least give a nice little wink and handshake to some of our fans to like, look, we're going to maybe dip into that. Like, I remember reading Treasure Island as part of my research for Black Flag, because I wanted to see, where does the modern pirate cliche come from? Like the parrot and the patch and the peg leg and all that. We actually had shirts on Black Flag that said no hooks, no parrots. Assassin's Creed Black Flag. We made an explicit, we said, no, we're not going to do hooks, parrots, or eye patches. I think there's one eye patch in like a downloadable costume, but the bad pirate, Stede Bonnet, who's now being immortalized in that great show, Our Flag Means Death. We have him show up at one point where he turns, he's got a patch, and he's like, because he's the one, of course he has a patch, because he's the bad pirate. He doesn't know what he's doing. Going back to, Caesar and Cleopatra, sure, certainly there were probably cultural or pop culture expectations that, now, as I said, I left that project to go work on something else at Ubisoft, so I did a lot of research. But in their depiction of Cleopatra, certainly there were, because I remember when I was doing the research, I was saying, actually very explicitly, we had a consumer test where we made a couple different portraits of Cleopatra, and we drew her in a Hellenistic kind of wardrobe, as you would see on one of the coins, right? And as you see, I think in one of those Orientalist paintings that's famous from like the 1870s, where Cleopatra's sort of sitting there and she's got this white flowing almost toga-like thing, or very Hellenistic. We modeled a version of Cleopatra after that. And then we had a second concept art that was like full-on Elizabeth Taylor, like snakes and the almost cobra-looking thing.
Oh, like the double crown?
Yeah, the double crown, yeah. And but there's also this kind of like, it looks like it's striped, and like Tutankhamun is wearing. It has that kind of like,
oh, the headdress.
Yeah. We drew that full-on Egypt, full-on assimilated queen look. And we showed it in front of a bunch of test audiences, late teenagers, early 20s. And they're like, which one looks most like Cleopatra to you? Boop, they all go right for the Egyptian one, right? They don't. And I remember when I was sort of on the project, I was like, yeah, we can use both of them. Like, let's do the Hellenistic one when she's just chilling out in her palace and she's doing business and politicking and talking with foreign emissaries. But when she wants to talk to the people and say she's a woman of the upper Nile, she wants to convince them, she'll change into that and she'll be like, hey. And they're like, okay, yeah. And that, I don't think that first costume ever appeared in the game, which is very common because it's very expensive to make characters like this, and our games have a lot of them. So I would not be surprised if they just said, we just don't have the budget or the time to make all the things you ever wanted. If you could do all the things I ever wanted, they'd have a different change of clothes every day. Because, it's like the Charlie Brown syndrome. It's like, why does he always wear that shirt? Just that one shirt. It's the same thing with, characters in games. Unless you can like, customize your avatar, but all the other characters, they never change. So I kind of wanted that. But so yeah, it's a question I think that stays with us until the very, very end of a project, is how much actual history can we get in here? How much do we have to tweak to fit our needs for game design? How much can we not afford to put in because of time? And how much does the audience expect? It's like, these are four competing impulses that we're always juggling. There's no right answer. You you tend to have to make decisions like this based on some sort of higher razor, like, well, we want to give this experience. So, this is the memories of this character. So we're not going to be objective in this realm, but we will try to be on it in this realm. Because if this is depending on the kind of person you're playing in the game, maybe certain details aren't as important.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting because also I remember when I heard about Valhalla, I remember thinking I've watched the History Vikings and I know there's a bunch of other, the Last Kingdom, so there's so many Viking things. So I was kind of like, oh, I wonder, am I gonna get essentially Vikings the game? And then obviously it was different. It was its own thing. And I was like, oh, I like this. This is great. Different mediums do different things. But I thought it was interesting because I remember I had a great conversation with with an expert who did Scandinavian studies about women in 9th century England. And I was like, yeah, it was amazing. I played as obviously Canon Eivor, so I'm like badass. It's like living my Lagertha dream fantasy running around in this game. And she was like, well, I hate to burst your bubble, but like that wasn't a thing. And I was like, what? Stop. Don't tell me that. It's interesting. So I kind of took that into a conversation with another friend of mine who studies like historical video games. And we got into this great conversation about, okay, there's history, then there's like just accessibility for all gaming audiences. And then there's like the people who don't care. So I'm kind of curious, like, does it register? Like, is it something you spend time on or not at all? Where for the people who are like, I don't care who I play as, I don't care if it's historical, I just want a good story, right? I just want to play as the canon character.
Right.
Or is it given more consideration to, okay, well, historically, this was a thing versus, okay, this is a modern game audience? Like, how much of that kind of bleeds into each other?
Great question that we spend a lot of time thinking about. We actually asked Jackson Crawford a lot of these questions, and his view that we sort of took this view was that, there's not a ton of evidence for badass women like Eivor. There's some burial sites that seem to point to some evidence like that, but of women warriors and things like that. And certainly in the social structure of Norse society was a lot more, women had a lot more sort of rights and compared with the Saxons at the same time. But Jackson's view was, he's like, if you look at their myths, there are a lot of warrior women in the myths. So his idea was that the Norse imagination was primed for that kind of thing. And so we like, that's kind of true. And so we kind of took it from there. And the names of all these myths escape me. So I'm not going to be able to like pull them off the top of my head. That was an inspiration that coincides with a desire that, yes, like the game before us, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, had offered the choice of playing as a male or female. That kind of choice in games is often just because your audience is big and you want it to be inclusive and bring people in and play in a way that they can jump into this world in a way that feels comfortable and interesting to them. And certainly sometimes decisions like that rub against how history would have actually unfolded, or the historical fact. If you dig deep into the way we wrote our story, because we decided that the so-called canon Eivor is a female, and it's a female name, the male that you choose, though, has some very specific significance in our game. I'm going to spoil it here now for people who haven't played the game. But we made the decision that it wasn't that you could play one version of the game as a woman and then the other version, if you played as a male, that just didn't exist. It's actually what you're playing as is the reincarnated spirit of Odin, who in our series was a real person. In Assassin's Creed, Odin was a real character that existed long, long, long ago. So what you have is, because of the weirdness of our franchise and the science fiction aspect of it, female Eivor is a reincarnation of a male character who came long, long before. And so the choice that you're making when you play, and you can switch on the fly, which is really weird in our game. You can switch on the fly. It's basically this device, the Animus, going, how do I represent this character as her human self right now, or as this set of memories that's embedded in her as the male version of herself from millennia ago? So that's an example of using our kind of franchise's peculiar science fiction pedigree to both tell a coherent story that all makes sense, no matter which one you pick, because Odin, he's the Viking, right? He's like all the Vikings who existed in the ninth century and 10th century, whatever, would have looked to Odin as like, yeah, that's the model, that's the paragon of what we're doing. And so we like the idea that, yeah, if you pick male Eivor, there's no male Eivor technically. You're playing as Odin, and then reincarnated in this body of this woman who, the story itself is really, we tried to write it. All the writers, I mean, there were a lot of writers in this game. We tried, without being too on the nose, because it had to work for male and female, but we tried to organize it where there's a woman who's constantly being overshadowed by her brother because of the structure of the society. And like, this is a woman who will not be asked to lead their clan, because of course not. But over the course of the game, she proves through one act of valor and heroism after another, and one act of glory, that yeah, she's actually the right one for the job. So by the end of it, it's like, okay, come on, she's the leader. So we tried to structure the story of that so that even though it wasn't explicit, that it felt like there was, if there was a metaphor, I'd do it, but like a glass ceiling that she's trying to smash through, but her brother is sitting on it. And if you go through, especially the beats with the Sigurd character, the brother Sigurd, there's always this kind of demand that you follow him. You demand that you listen to what he says. Do not question what he says. How dare you step out of line? Other guys step forward in the clan are like, I'm going to challenge you because you're trying to lead us and you don't deserve to. We tried to get that in there, but of course it couldn't be too explicit, because if you were playing as the male character, it would seem a little odd to people. So it was a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like that's often the answer with most things in gaming, when you're trying to make sure that you nod to the people you need to, but also you're trying to cram as much as you need to in. So I feel like that is pretty standard, consideration that will come.
Yeah, unless you're doing a game that has an incredible amount of what we call branching dialogue, or branching paths where the story can change depending on the things you do. It's very, very hard to write. Or I'd say it's impossible to write a story. If it was a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. It's the same story. I don't think there's many periods in history where you could say that, right? Like, if any, right? You'd always expect, and let's get all the way back to James Joyce. He said something like, within the particular is contained the universal. You need to tell a specific story about a specific person, about a specific trial or tribulation they went through, so that you can resonate with a broad number of people. If you try to make the story really generic, then it's actually not going to resonate with lots of people, because it's a curious, almost contradiction. The more specific a story is, the more specific the details are, the more it will seem real to the audience. And so that's unfortunately what you have to do when you say like, oh, you can play as male or female. Well, there's a lot of details you have to leave out about their daily life, because you just couldn't get into, you couldn't be like, you couldn't have, some character ask male Eivor, like if he was pregnant, for instance, like that would, you just think that detail, you have to just avoid that subject altogether, because it would be different depending on, who is having that conversation. And so that, as a writer, you're like, I'm robbed of these opportunities to write this more specificity. You find other ways to. I actually often find that the fun and detail comes in the side characters, not the protagonists, but all the other characters. You get to really have fun and specific details with the NPCs, what we call non-player characters.
Yeah, no, and there's always some really memorable ones. Like I definitely have my favorites who kind of have their own elaborate backstories. And then when you get to intersect with them, it's always really fun. And sometimes they'll have a historical nugget in there, and sometimes they won't. As a person with a background in classic, my favorite Assassin's Creed is probably Odyssey, just because ancient Greece is my thing. But yeah, I was like, history is great because sometimes you have the NPCs who you can build their own story, and then some, you're interacting with like Socrates, and you're like, does he really need a huge backstory? Because he's already got like a lot right there. Like you just say Socrates, and I'm like, I know who this is. You, this dude. To not go too much further into the rabbit hole, because I swear I could talk about these games all day, all week, all year. In terms of the last kind of thing I really wanted to ask was, with the introduction in the last 3 games, I believe, with the Discovery Tours, that I know that's created specifically to be a more educational mode for people who do want to go deeper into the history.
Yeah.
Even that is still like an interactable game thing. So
Yeah.
how much more can you cram in there with the accurate history versus like the normal games, but also how much do you still have to be like, but it's still a game?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the Discovery Tour is something that I remember the creative director Jean Guédon always wanted. He was like the brand narrative manager before he became the creative director of Black Flag. And I think he'd always had this dream since pretty early to, is there some way we can just turn off the violence and let you just sort of roam and explore? You can see that the Discovery Tours are, each one of them is quite different. Each one has a different form. And I think that comes from trying to figure out the best recipe for retaining a sense of agency for the player. You've got this big world, and even the new game Mirage has a really robust database. There's no Discovery Tour. It's almost like the Discovery Tour is layered into the game itself. You can go discover these like little shards, and it will give you history. I do like Valhalla's a lot. It's a kind of a story-based one. It takes you kind of on a more dramatic narrative, but because the production value that it took to get those narratives up to a certain level, it means that I think a lot of the world is left untouched, right? I think that's the question, is what is the proper form of interactivity? Games are at their best when, I think Ralph Koster said this. He writes on games, a game theorist. He said something like, games are just an interesting series of decisions. And I love that definition because I think it applies to all of my favorite games. The idea that whenever I'm playing, if the game is asking me to make an interesting decision, either in micro decisions or a couple macro decisions and at a different pace, like make a bunch of small decisions and now make one big decision. Okay, make a bunch of small games that don't do that, that just make you say, walk forward, press X. Okay, now walk forward, press X, watch this scene, go press these 3 buttons. Now we're going to give you a new scene. Like if you're following the motions and you're not making interesting decisions, then people can tune out pretty rapidly. So the trick with teaching history through a video game is, how do you bridge the gap between giving players the agency to make decisions for themselves versus the pedagogical requirement to just teach people something? Like, hey, you don't know this, so sit down and we're going to tell you about it. Open your ears and listen. Maybe it's a series of like short, like, listen to this, now go play this and try to make decisions based on what you've learned. Not like in a quiz format. We don't want like there's going to be a quiz at the end of this game. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky question. I do love the Discovery Tours, but I also do know that the designers of them, they struggle with this central question. It's like, what is the interactive experience? Is it good enough to be I don't even know what's the best museum in the world for this kind of thing, right? Like an interactive museum, like science centers. My son, he loves to go to a science center where he can go make a robot do cool things, or he can play with water or sand, and he can put funnels or put prisms and make light shine, right? There's an I'm making interesting decisions. I want the light to shine this way. And then same principle applies. We need to figure out how to make the science museum format our interactive history museum. And to be honest, we got the Valhalla team, we got the best version of that, which was, we took a fact-finding trip at the end of 2008 to the Lofoten Islands in Norway, and we stayed the Lofoter Viking Museum, and we stayed after hours, and we got to participate in a big ceremony and a dinner, and got our hands on, and we cooked on the same things they cooked, and we played the musical instruments like they would have played. So it's like this very interactive form of learning. Even we can't give you with a video game. Like, I can't let you experience the feeling of kneading your own kind of unleavened bread, or playing this bizarre lute or lyre like thing. And I guess maybe virtual reality, that's at some point you'll get to actually interact in weird ways like that. Like, I even had the experience in York. There's a good Viking museum. They had a bunch of locks, like very ancient 9th century locks, these really primitive things that would be easy to crack by today's standards, but you have this huge chunk of metal and you have this huge key, and you're like, ka-chunk, ka-chunk, and it's cool. And it's like, okay, I get to see the mechanism and how it works, and that was invaluable. That's things like that we are not able to give our audience yet, but getting there. Did you like the Discovery tours? Which one was the best, or which one captivated you the most?
Yeah, it's interesting because as a historian, there I can see the value for all the different iterations of it. And it's interesting. I think I liked the story part of Valhalla's. I liked how it was a playable story. But I think that what I didn't love about Odyssey and Valhalla's was also like once you like started the station or the cutscene or the something, you kind of had to just do that. I liked Origins in terms of like you could hear the thing read to you, but like you could also like move your character around. So like as I'm listening,
Right,
and
right.
permitting one of the stations where it's not just a block of the text and a picture, I could still walk around. So if they're like talking about the columns or something, I could literally like walk by around and like look at the columns while it's being read to me, so that way it's both visual and auditory, and I really like that
Yeah, and there's a
aspect. And so
sense of agency that we're talking about, right? Where it's like you get to do something. The great picture of Napoleon's crowning in the Louvre.
Mhm.
It's a static picture, but you get to walk around and look at it. You get to choose where to look and how to take it in. And yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's interesting because while Odyssey was like my favorite game, I think the Discovery Tour and Odyssey was my least favorite of the
Hmm.
three. Because I felt that was too much. Because once you triggered the station, you don't control your character at all. It just goes right into like a cutscene thing where, yeah, it reads you the thing and then it will flip to different portions of what's there, and they'll show you people dancing, and then it'll cut to showing you a slowly panned around room, and you're like, okay, that's great, but I want to control where in the room I'm going. So
Yeah.
it's not even that I like need to do a lot. I think it's just like, let me just move within area
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I can look.
Okay.
Right. So it's still limited in terms of its actual interactivity, but like more than just that. It's really interesting. Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about it because it does actually impact my decisions when choosing like what games to use or how I would craft educational material in making archeo gaming videos,
Mhm.
because I got to account for, okay, well, if this is like a story or if this is this, if I just use this footage, people are going to be confused, or so it does kind of shape how I have to approach it. And from friends who are educators who want to use these games in their classrooms, they say the same thing, like, well, now I have to choose which game because now I don't know what do I use, because I don't want it to completely overshadow me when I'm teaching. It's a big topic of discussion, I think, in educational circles. I think we get closer with each new game as you're testing new things out, but I don't think we've hit on it quite yet, but we're like, I can feel it, we're so close.
I'm not super involved in that side of things, but I'd be curious if Ubisoft has actually talked to the people that use the Discovery tours and gotten feedback from them. And obviously the dream would be that, in like 10 years time, when we've like covered, like 25 time periods, that there's this one Uber product that you could just zoom in like Google Maps and go like, what time period and what location? Zoom. Oh, we've got that. We've got that. And then you've got the full map to explore and all the Discovery tours all there in one go. But that would be a very massive file. But
That would be a lot.
with streaming, maybe it's possible.
But you know what? I know
Yeah.
historians who would gladly use it, even though it's huge. If you give us like the buffet table, and I could just go to each platter and be like, okay, now we're gonna do this one and this one, I think it would be incredibly well received. So I guess the last question before we get to the poem that I really wanted to ask was, just as someone who comes from the game design realm, who does game stuff, but also as someone who has done a lot of research, and I think historians don't, we just don't know, because right, we're not told, so we can't appreciate how much research that people who are making the games actually have to do. And so it's a misconception when you talk to like
Yeah.
educators that were like, they probably just half-assed it, which is not true. But like, for all those historians out there who are going to complain and be like, no, I don't want to use that, even the educational mode in my classroom, because it's probably half-assed, what would you say to encourage academics to actually use these games in classrooms?
I've said the simple answer is that for maybe any of the shortcomings that you may see, the gigantic benefit is that it engages people in a very, very immediate fashion. I actually literally just reconnected with a friend from high school and university who is now a history teacher and who has taught history in all over the world. I made some comment like, "Hey, and it's good to reconnect with you. And sorry if Assassin's Creed has made your job more difficult." And he's like, "On the contrary, it makes it easier." He's like, "Kids, when I get to certain subjects, There's always a couple kids in the class that are like, oh yeah, I know everything about pirates, or I know everything about, ancient Egypt, or I know, and it's because of Assassin's Creed. It just, it's almost like if I wanted my kid to really get into like crazy, avant-garde jazz, I could start them with stuff that was not quite jazz, and then they'd fall right into, the late 60s Miles Davis stuff. But you can't start them right there because they'd just be like, what is this insanity? And that's probably how I reacted to history when I was in high school. I was like, yeah, this is great, but it doesn't speak to me as a story, and I don't see the characters, and I don't, for good or ill, we are storytelling creatures, and that's not always a good thing because we can fall for some pretty bad stories. But the beautiful thing about history is even if you hear a bad story about history, it's going to prime you for the better stories and the more, let's say, accurate stories. If you come through Valhalla and you think that, yeah, they all look like a bunch of tattooed bikers, like, what is this? They're not even wearing the period accurate clothing. It's like, well, we will bring them through the door and then you can show them the wardrobe later. And I think it almost always works because once you set foot in there and you accept that, oh, this is a time period in which, well, that's the thing I always wrestle with is when you look at a time period, you just want to answer the two questions. How are these people exactly like we are today? And how are these people completely different than we are? And you try to find those two and create some kind of beautiful thing. So the job that we try to do is, how are these people a lot like we are today? That allows people to, because humans are humans and we've all had the same kind of general kind of impulses. And so if you could show younger players that, especially, then they're going to get interested in the other side, the more complex side, the stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, trying to understand how honor and shame culture worked in Norse society, which is quite different than like Christian virtue. And, like, so we'll tell the human story. They'll be in the tent at that point, and then you can, serve them the harder stuff, and often the more interesting stuff, or more complicated stuff, let's say.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
A good
Yeah.
entry point. And, this will
Yeah,
launch
like
you
I honestly don't think I've ever heard somebody say,
learn
like,
more.
yeah, I was so into pirates when I played Black Flag, but then I started reading about pirates, and they're all so boring, and they're not nearly as exciting as Assassin's Creed Black Flag's pirates. Like, that has never ever been said, because the history is always more nuanced, more interesting, so chock full of more detail. And in fact, sometimes the weird, almost accidental contingencies of history are more interesting than a standard dramatic structure. It's really funny in history when you're like, and then this king was planning this, and then this, and then he slipped on a banana peel and died. No story writer would ever write that, because you'd be like, you can't do that. But history does that all the time. And when you're reading it, you're like, that's crazy. How do these brief, weird accidents happen? And the fact that it is history automatically means you can buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Well, I gotta get us into this poem reading, but there's like 1,000 other questions I could have asked, but I will not. But yeah, so at the end of each podcast, every guest will read Shelley's Ozymandias poem, and then just after you've read it, if you could just tell us, what do you think about this poem? This is a poem that a lot of people have thought is really well crafted and wonderful and beautiful and has a great message, but I'd just be curious to see if you agree or not, or just, do you think it's interesting?
Yeah, cool. Let's do it. All right. And this is actually apt, right? Because Ozymandias is what the Greek form of which, Ramses? Is it yeah. Okay. All right. Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: my name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I think I probably have the more common interpretation, which is obviously that the mighty and powerful in their day always have this sort of delusional sense that their power is forever and that they are immortal in some sense. And yet time marches on, and the earth is the great it was in the time of King George that these personages, rich and poor, noble and peasant, quarreled. They are all equal now. And it's kind of like that, where it's just like, yeah, especially the sands of the desert just whipping endlessly and grinding things down, and the power of the past is now just a curiosity, like a nameless curiosity, like the fact that this unnamed narrator can say, and on the pedestal these words appear. The reality would be that somebody would walk by and go like, what are all these cartoons? They wouldn't even be able to read them. So who is this like omnipotent narrator, or this traveler who can actually read? I guess they have a copy of the Rosetta Stone somewhere. Yeah, it's a beautiful poem though, and I like, let's say the middle 8 lines are very they ebb and flow like in a kind of a syntax that is a bit disorienting, kind of like the fever dream, the sneer of cold command. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's not blank verse because it's rhymed. It's iambic, though, iambic pentameter. When I was first writing the casting scripts for Origins, and I was trying to figure out how to depict people speaking Greek and people speaking Egyptian, because there would have been a lot of crossover. And so I decided in the casting scripts that the Greek would be in iambic pentameter, blank verse, and that Egyptian would be in prose. And actually, a lot of the actors auditioned with those scripts, and they turned out really well. I wish I could share them, but I think they have to stay locked away for now. But I had a lot of fun writing a blank verse for Caesar and Cleopatra, which is, someone before me has done that. But
oh man, someone unlock those from the vaults, please. Yeah. I think that would be so cool.
Maybe I can ask if I can share them. That was actually another thing that I wanted to do, and it was curious to me that Shakespeare had never, he wrote about a lot of old kings, but he never wrote anything about Alfred the Great, possibly because it was much too far in the past. But I always thought a kind of a new Shakespeare play could be discovered. That was him writing some, the heroic history play about King Alfred's valiant defense of the sceptered isle. So I was thinking about at some point, how do I get some fake sections of that play into Valhalla? Could I write them myself and pretend that they were discovered? I never got around to it, but I would have loved to have done it.
I would have loved to see that, and I think a lot of other people would too. Darn. Okay, well that would be so good.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, this poem, it's so evocative for so many different reasons, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. This ephemeral nature of power and legacy, monumentality, all these great things, which, we have the benefit of looking back on history and being like, well, how'd that work out for you, my dude? But I guess when considering the poem just like that, the last question I ask every single guest on the show is, if you think about our world right now, do we have like a modern version of an Ozymandias, like something we think is so amazing and great, and we think it's gonna last forever, but will it? And this could be idea, person, place, thing. It can be anything.
Certainly, there don't seem to, I don't live in any sort of authoritarian countries right now, so in countries that I visit frequently, the penchant for self-aggrandizing architecture is not as prevalent. So we have beautiful things, right, like the Eiffel Tower and stuff like that, but it doesn't have the same sort of like oblivious arrogance that the picture, the statues of Ramses, and I don't even know where I'd put the pyramids. Like the pyramids are sort of opaque, and like what are they for? Like clearly they were the project of a pharaoh, a burial chamber, but when you look at them, they don't transmit like their obvious purpose. It's not like, oh, that guy thought a lot of himself. I don't feel like we have that as much where, in Canada and the US, where I'm from. So certainly there's that book, I think it's called The World Without Us, that talks about how quickly everything would fade away if humans were to disappear tomorrow. And we haven't built too many things to last. Like the pyramids are actually, because they're in the desert and they're so massive and so heavy, and they actually probably will outlive anything we build now in the 20th century and 21st century. I don't know. So yeah, like what do you think?
Oh man, there's been so many good answers on the show. I think I've had a couple people say capitalism. I've had a lot of people actually say the internet. Like we think, when you say like, "Oh, don't put that online because it'll be on the internet forever and people will see this permanent record." And I'm like, "Yeah, but the internet's like held in a few massive servers in like Silicon Valley or whatever." And I'm like, if that went down, no, goodbye internet.
Oh no, I don't think I've ever said that because I think it's pretty self-evident. If you study enough history and you study enough time periods, none of these things, I guess, yeah, they have an expectation of surviving, but for those things, even like if you take, let's say, a religion I'm familiar with because I grew up within it, Christianity has been evolving since the day it started, right? And the Christianity of, the third century is very different than the Aquinas's Christianity and very different than the prosperity gospel of the modern United States. Like the only similarity, it seems, is that everyone calls it Christianity and they all kind of look back at the same book, but for different reasons. It's like a ship of Theseus. It's like, oh, Christianity's been around for 2,000 years, but has it been around? Capitalism's been around for, let's say, what, 400 or 500 years in its modern state. But is it the same capitalism?
I mean, there's no right answer. It's meant to be a very open-ended question. So it's okay. It's meant to be just whatever first comes to your mind. So I did kind of lie. There's one actual last question I'm going to ask you, and that's, do you want to direct people or tell them about projects that you either have worked on that are coming out that you want to, just say, where can people find you essentially?
I got off a platform formerly known as Twitter. So I'm on LinkedIn, but I sort of just decided to kind of flush a lot of social media from my life because I'm too busy and I want to be even busier. But yes, I mean, I'm at Ubisoft. I'm working on another Assassin's Creed game that we teased last year, codename Hexa. That's all I can say about it. There's teasers online. Can't even say when you could reasonably expect for it to come out. But it's going to be great. It's some of the most fun I've ever had working on in games and some of the most interesting and deep research I've ever done. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing that in the future.
Okay, well, everyone, I'm sure will be waiting with bated breath like I am. But yes, okay, well, we will. I'll put some links, to some of the games you've worked on. So for people who may not be gamers or into gaming, I'll let them decide if they want to pick up one of the games you've worked on. So
cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. It's been so fun. And maybe it's because I'm the history nerd, but I know that somewhere in the conversation when you were like, oh, yes, I could write a book or spend a whole episode talking just about the historical things that we had to talk through, I was like, well, maybe that will be a thing in the future. So, cool. Yeah, I hope you'll join us again. But thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.